I found my husband's hidden divorce papers, so I quietly shifted my $400 million into a private account. They always say trust is the first thing to die in a marriage. But in my case, it was trust, and then my entire financial empire. I'm Nyla Monroe, and if you've heard of Monrovia Capital, you know my name. 34 years old, self-made billionaire, and until 3 weeks ago, I thought I had the perfect marriage. The kind of woman who graced Forbes covers with headlines like the Queen of Alternative Investments and how Nyla Monroe built a Wall Street empire before 35. But success has a funny way of painting targets on your back, even from the people who sleep next to you every night. It was a Tuesday evening in October when my world shifted on its axis. I wasn't snooping through Damien's things. God knows I had better ways to spend my time than playing detective in my own home. I was looking for our estate planning documents, specifically the updated will we'd supposedly signed 6 months earlier. Our lawyer had called about some tax implications, and I needed the originals. Damien was in London on business, or so he'd told me. The house felt too quiet, too empty, with just the hum of the security system and the distant sounds of Manhattan traffic filtering through our penthouse windows. I made my way to his home office, a room I rarely entered. It wasn't that I was forbidden, nothing so dramatic. It's just that we'd always maintained our separate professional spaces. Mutual respect, we called it. The safe was hidden behind a false panel in his bookshelf. I'd seen him open it countless times, never thinking much of it. The combination was our wedding anniversary. How sickeningly romantic, right? The heavy door swung open with a satisfying click, revealing neat stacks of documents, jewelry boxes, and a few flash drives I'd never noticed before. The estate documents weren't there. Instead, my fingers found something else entirely, a sleek silver folder that definitely hadn't been there the last time I'd glimpsed inside. My name was written on the tab in Damien's careful handwriting, and Monroe, confidential. Confidential? In a safe I had access to? That was the first red flag. Inside the folder, my hands trembled as I lifted out a thick stack of papers. The letterhead made my blood run cold. Hartwell, Steinberg and Associates, Family Law Division. Divorce papers. And signed, but dated 3 months ago. 3 months ago, when Damien had been particularly affectionate, when we talked about expanding our art collection, when he'd surprised me with a weekend in the Hamptons, just because. The petition cited irreconcilable differences and requested an equitable distribution of marital assets. Standard language, really. What wasn't standard was what came next. Attached to the divorce papers were financial disclosure forms, dozens of them, outlining every account, every investment, every asset I'd built from nothing. My life's work reduced to line items on legal documents. But it was the last document that made me sink into Damien's leather chair, the air rushing out of my lungs like I'd been punched. Power of attorney templates. Financial transfer authorizations. Asset liquidation orders. All prepared in advance. All waiting for signatures. And there, at the bottom of several documents, was a digital signature I recognized immediately. Not Damien's. My sister Kendall's. Kendall, who I'd trusted with my life. Kendall, who worked as my chief financial officer. Kendall, who had access to every account, every password, every financial secret I'd ever had. Kendall, whose signature was already on documents designed to strip me of everything I'd built. The room started spinning. Not from emotion, I was past that now. From the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. This wasn't just a husband wanting out of a marriage. This was a carefully orchestrated coup. They weren't just planning to divorce me. They were planning to destroy me. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at those papers. My sister's signature seemed to mock me from the page. How long had they been planning this? How many family dinners had I sat through, laughing with Kendall about client stories, while she was plotting to steal everything from me? How many nights had I fallen asleep next to Damien, trusting him with my dreams, while he was calculating how much those dreams were worth? Something clicked inside me then. A switch flipped from victim to predator. The tears that had been threatening to fall dried up instantly. My breathing steadied. My hands stopped shaking. They thought they knew me. Sweet, trusting Nyla, who built her empire on handshake deals and believed the best in people. Naive Nyla, who gave her sister the keys to the kingdom and her husband access to her deepest vulnerabilities. They were about to learn they'd never know me at all. I carefully photographed every document with my phone, making sure to capture every signature, every date, every detail. Then I placed everything back exactly as I'd found it, closed the safe, and walked calmly to my own office. If they wanted to play games with my empire, they'd just activated the most dangerous player on the board. And unlike them, I knew all the rules, including the ones they'd never thought to learn. The hunt was about to begin. Blood is thicker than water, sure.
But money?
That flows like poison through a family's veins. Sleep didn't come that night. Instead, I sat in my home office until dawn, staring at my laptop screen, wrestling with a decision that would change everything. I had two choices: confront them and risk tipping my hand, or dig deeper and uncover the full scope of their betrayal. The businesswoman in me knew there was only one logical path forward. I needed intelligence, and I knew exactly where to find it. Kendall had always been careless with digital security. Growing up, she'd use the same password for everything, our childhood dog's name followed by her birth year. Rusty 1989. Old habits die hard, and I was betting she hadn't evolved much since joining Monrovia Capital 3 years ago. By 6 a.m., I was in my downtown office, the city still quiet except for the occasional taxi and early joggers. The Monrovia building stood like a glass monument to everything I'd achieved, and now it felt like I was fighting for its very soul. I made coffee, strong and black, and settled in for what I knew would be a long day of detective work. As CFO, Kendall had her own secure email server, but she also maintained archived accounts on our main corporate system. All perfectly legal for me to access as CEO, though I'd never had reason to before now. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very transparency I'd built into our company's structure was about to expose her betrayal. I started with emails from 3 months ago, right around the time those divorce papers were dated. At first, everything looked normal. Client reports, meeting schedules, budget discussions. But then I noticed something odd, a pattern of emails sent late at night, always after business hours, always to an external address I didn't recognize. Email protected. My heart hammered as I opened the first one, dated September 15th. D. The quarterly numbers are solid, and still hasn't noticed the Hong Kong transfers. She trusts me completely with the offshore structures. We need to move faster on the timeline. K. The Hong Kong transfers? What Hong Kong transfers? I immediately pulled up our international holdings, searching for any transactions I hadn't personally authorized. There they were, 3 separate wire transfers totaling $2.8 million, all routed through shell companies I'd never heard of, all bearing Kendall's authorization code. My hands were shaking again, but this time from rage, not shock. I kept reading. October 2nd. The London meetings went perfectly, and actually thanked me for managing the complex structures while she focused on new acquisitions. She has no idea I've been creating parallel accounts. The Vancouver property purchase should clear next week. K. Vancouver property? We didn't own any Vancouver property. But apparently someone did, someone using Monrovia Capital's credit lines and my personal guarantees. October 18th. D. She's getting suspicious about the estate planning documents. Maybe we pushed too hard on the power of attorney angle. We need to accelerate phase 2. Can you handle the legal side while I finish the soft exits? The Cayman structures are almost ready for the final transfers. K. Phase 2? Soft exits? The Cayman structures? Each revelation hit like a physical blow. This wasn't just about divorce proceedings. They were systematically hollowing out my company, using my own sister's access to move assets into accounts I'd never see. But it was the email from October 25th that made me physically ill. Damien, I know this is hard for you. I see how you look at her sometimes, and I know part of you still cares. But remember what we talked about. She built this empire by stepping on people, by putting business before family. She chose money over having children, career over marriage. This isn't just about getting what we deserve. This is about teaching her that actions have consequences. The prenup protects most of her assets, but the business structures we've created will give us control over the operational cash flow. By the time she realizes what's happening, we'll have enough leverage to negotiate from a position of strength. She'll have to choose: fight us and risk destroying everything she's built, or accept a quiet exit and preserve her precious legacy. Either way, we win. K. I stared at that email until the words blurred. My own sister, painting me as some heartless corporate shark who'd sacrificed family for fortune. Twisting every difficult decision, every sacrifice I'd made to build something lasting, into evidence of my unworthiness. The cruelest part? Some of it was true. I had chosen career over children. I had worked 18-hour days while Damien felt neglected. I had asked Kendall to manage the financial structures because I trusted her completely, freeing me to focus on acquisitions and growth. But those choices weren't about greed or selfishness. They were about building something bigger than myself, something that could support dozens of families, something that could last generations. Everything I'd done with the assumption that the people I loved most were on my side. I found 63 emails in total, spanning 4 months of meticulous planning. They'd identified weaknesses in our corporate structure I didn't even know existed. They'd created financial instruments designed to siphon assets slowly enough that I wouldn't notice until it was too late. They'd even prepared media statements explaining my voluntary step back from active management due to personal challenges. The worst part? They were good at it. Damien's legal expertise combined with Kendall's financial access had created a nearly perfect plan. If I hadn't stumbled across those divorce papers, if I hadn't thought to check her emails, they might have pulled it off. But I had found out. And now they'd made the biggest mistake of their lives, underestimating exactly who they were trying to destroy. I printed every email, backed up every file, and started making lists. Not of what I'd lost, but of what I was going to take back. They thought they were playing chess while I was playing checkers. Time to show them they'd brought checkers to a battle. I built Monrovia Capital from scratch. The same hands they planned to empty, I used to shift every damn dollar before they could blink. The thing about being underestimated is that it gives you the ultimate strategic advantage. While Kendall and Damien were congratulating themselves on their brilliant scheme, they'd forgotten one crucial detail. I hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by being naive. I'd built it by being 3 steps ahead of everyone else. By Thursday morning, I had a plan. Not the emotional, scorched earth response they probably expected if I ever discovered their betrayal. This was something far more dangerous, a surgical strike that would neutralize their power while keeping my own hands completely clean. The beauty of their conspiracy was also its fatal flaw. They'd assumed I was too trusting, too focused on the big picture to notice the details. But every hidden account they'd created, every shell company they'd established, had been built using Monrovia Capital's existing infrastructure. Infrastructure I designed. Systems I controlled. I started with the $400 million in high-liquidity assets they clearly thought they had access to. These weren't just any assets. They were the crown jewels of our portfolio. Cryptocurrency holdings, precious metals futures, and a series of short-term bonds that could be moved quickly without triggering regulatory scrutiny. Exactly the kind of assets you'd want if you were planning to disappear someone's wealth overnight. The ironic thing? Kendall had actually made my job easier. Her careful documentation of their parallel structures had given me a complete roadmap of their plan. I knew exactly which accounts they intended to drain and in what order. My first move was to reactive several dormant corporate shells I'd created years earlier for tax optimization purposes. These weren't hidden accounts. They were perfectly legal entities that had simply been sitting unused in our corporate structure. Phoenix Holdings LLC, established in Delaware 3 years ago. Meridian International, incorporated in Nevada for a deal that never materialized. Trinity Asset Management, created for a cryptocurrency venture that got shelved. While Kendall was in meetings that Thursday discussing Q4 projections with our junior analysts, I quietly began transferring assets. Not stealing, these were my assets, my companies, my decisions. But I moved them through channels she'd never think to monitor. The cryptocurrency portfolio went first. $15 million in Bitcoin and Ethereum, transferred to cold storage wallets I'd established through Phoenix Holdings. The transactions looked like standard portfolio rebalancing, exactly the kind of moves I made regularly to optimize our tax position. Next came the precious metals futures. $42 million in gold and silver contracts quietly shifted to Meridian International's accounts. Again, perfectly normal corporate restructuring that wouldn't raise any red flags until someone looked very closely at the beneficiary accounts. The bonds were trickier. $343 million in short-term official and corporate debt instruments. These required more finesse, because moving them in bulk would definitely trigger compliance reviews. So I did it the way I'd learned in my early days, small moves spread across multiple accounts, using different authorization codes and timing the transfers to coincide with normal market activity. The most brilliant part? I used some of the same offshore structures Kendall had created for their scheme. Those Cayman accounts she'd mentioned in her emails? They were established through Monrovia's existing relationships with international banks. Banks that knew me personally, that had been doing business with me for years. It took exactly 3 phone calls to redirect the account authorizations. By Friday afternoon, I'd moved nearly all $400 million into a web of accounts that existed completely outside Kendall and Damien's conspiracy. The money was still mine, still legally held by Monrovia Capital subsidiaries, but now in structures they'd never identified and accounts they couldn't access. The beautiful thing about financial warfare is that it's almost invisible when done correctly. Our quarterly reports would still show the same asset totals. Our regulatory filings would still reflect proper corporate structures. But the actual control, the ability to move, sell, or leverage those assets, now rested entirely with me. I watched Kendall throughout that week, looking for any sign that she'd noticed the transfers. Nothing. She was too focused on phase 2 of their plan, whatever that entailed, to pay attention to the routine portfolio management I was ostensibly conducting. During our Friday executive meeting, she actually complimented me on this streamlined reporting structure she'd noticed in the preliminary numbers. The new account organization makes everything so much cleaner, she said with a smile that no longer fooled me for a second. I'm glad you approve, I replied, returning her smile with interest. I've been working hard to optimize our asset protection strategies. If only she knew exactly how protected those assets now were. Damien called that evening from London, his voice warm with false affection. How was your week, sweetheart? I missed you. Productive, I said, curled up in our living room with a glass of wine, watching the city lights twinkle below. Very productive. I think I've solved some problems that have been bothering me. That's wonderful. I can't wait to hear about it when I get home. Oh, he'd hear about it all right. Just not in the way he expected. They thought they were playing the long game, moving carefully to avoid detection. What they didn't realize was that I'd just checkmate them in a single week, and they didn't even know the game was over. I let them feel close to the win, just close enough to get sloppy. The hardest part wasn't moving the money or uncovering their conspiracy. The hardest part was pretending to be the same trusting wife and sister I'd been before I knew the truth. But if I'd learned anything in 15 years of high-stakes negotiations, it was that the best victories come from letting your opponents defeat themselves. Damien returned from London on a Sunday evening, full of stories about client meetings and market opportunities. He kissed me at the door with what I now recognized as performed affection, his hands lingering on my shoulders like he was memorizing the moment. I missed you, he said, and for a split second, I almost believed him. Almost forgot about the divorce papers hidden in his safe, the emails plotting my destruction, the systematic theft of everything I'd built. I missed you too, I replied, because that was what the old Nyla would have said. The trusting Nyla, who didn't know her husband, was counting down the days until he could destroy her. Over dinner, I deployed the first part of my trap. Kendall's been incredible this quarter, I said, cutting into the salmon he'd prepared, one of his specialties that used to make me feel cherished. I honestly don't know what I'd do without her. Something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe, or satisfaction that their plan was working so perfectly. She's always been devoted to you, he said carefully. Family loyalty means everything to her. Family loyalty. I had to grip my wine glass tighter to keep from laughing at the absurdity of it. I've been thinking, I continued, watching his reaction closely. Maybe it's time to give her more responsibility. Full signing authority on the offshore accounts, perhaps. She's earned it. This time, his reaction was unmistakable. A flash of excitement he couldn't quite hide, followed immediately by concern that I might be moving too fast for their timeline. "That's generous of you," he said. "But maybe you should think it through? That's a lot of responsibility." "Perfect." He was trying to slow me down, worried that giving Kendall too much access too quickly might make me suspicious. Little did he know I was already 10 steps ahead. The next morning, I called Kendall into my office for what I announced as a strategic planning session. She arrived with her usual armload of reports and that bright smile that had fooled me for so long. "I've been thinking about succession planning," I began, noting how her eyes immediately sharpened with interest. "Not that I'm going anywhere, but it's important to have systems in place." "Of course," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "What did you have in mind?" "I want to expand your authority significantly. Full access to the Cayman structures, signing power on the London accounts, and oversight of all our shell company operations." I watched her fight to contain her excitement. This was exactly what she'd been maneuvering toward, but getting it handed to her so easily must have felt almost too good to be true. "Nyla, that's a huge responsibility. Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything," I said, and that much was true. I was absolutely certain this would give her enough rope to hang herself. "You're the only person I trust completely." The words tasted like poison in my mouth, but they had the desired effect. Kendall's eyes actually welled up with tears of joy at being handed the keys to what she thought was my kingdom. "I won't let you down," she whispered. "I know you won't," I replied. That afternoon, I set up the second part of my trap. I arranged for Damien to take a business trip to San Francisco, ostensibly to meet with potential investors for a new fund we were considering. What he didn't know was that the investors were representatives of a shell company I'd created specifically for this purpose. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at the offices of Pacific Asset Management, a perfectly legitimate-sounding firm that existed solely on paper and in a temporary office space I'd rented for exactly 4 hours. The senior partners he'd be meeting with were actually actors I'd hired through a corporate consulting firm, armed with scripts I'd written and non-disclosure agreements that would prevent them from ever revealing the true nature of the meeting. Every word of that meeting would be recorded. Every document they showed him would be tracked. Every promise he made, every number he quoted, every lie he told about our assets would be captured in crystal-clear audio and video. But the real masterstroke was what I did with the accounts Kendall now thought she controlled. Using the mirrored email system I discovered during my investigation, I began feeding her false information. Fake account numbers that looked real, but led nowhere. Dummy LLC formations that existed only on paper. Investment opportunities that were actually sophisticated tracking systems designed to monitor every move she made. Every time she tried to access one of the accounts I'd actually moved, she'd find exactly what she expected to find, until the moment I was ready for her not to. Within 3 days, both Kendall and Damien were operating under the assumption that their plan was proceeding perfectly. Damien returned from San Francisco convinced he'd successfully negotiated with major investors who were eager to back his new venture after my inevitable departure. Kendall spent her days carefully documenting access codes and transfer protocols for assets she thought she was about to control. They were so focused on their endgame that they never noticed I was orchestrating their every move. During our Thursday quarterly board meeting, I stood before our senior staff and delivered what I knew would be my final performance as the naive, trusting CEO they thought they knew. "I want to publicly recognize Kendall Monroe for her exceptional loyalty and sacrifice," I announced, watching her beam with pride from her seat at the conference table. "Her dedication to this company and to our family has been truly remarkable." The applause was genuine. Everyone in that room respected Kendall, trusted her, saw her as my natural successor if anything ever happened to me. If only they knew what she was planning to make happen. After the meeting, I found her in the hallway, still glowing from the recognition. "Thank you for that," she said, hugging me tightly. "It means everything to have your confidence." "You've earned it," I replied, hugging her back and thinking about how this would probably be the last genuine physical contact we'd ever have as sisters. That night, as I lay in bed next to Damien, listening to his steady breathing and knowing he was probably dreaming about his new life without me, I allowed myself one moment of sadness for what I was about to lose. Not the money, I'd already protected that. Not the company, that was stronger than ever. But the family I'd thought I had. The marriage I'd believed in. The sister I'd loved unconditionally. Tomorrow, I would destroy all of that. But tonight, I let myself grieve for the last time. Because tomorrow, they'd finally learn who they'd really been trying to steal from. They thought they were taking my empire. Instead, they were signing a confession. The Monrovia Capital Anniversary Gala was always the event of the year. 500 guests, including every major player on Wall Street, financial journalists from 3 continents, and clients who collectively managed over $2 trillion in assets. This year's theme was Building Legacy, and the irony wasn't lost on me as I stood in the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom, watching Kendall and Damien work the room like they owned it. Kendall wore the emerald dress I'd bought for her birthday last year, the one she'd said made her feel like she could conquer the world. How prophetic. Damien was in his element, charming investors and spinning stories about exciting new developments at Monrovia. Neither of them had any idea that tonight would be the last time they'd ever attend one of these events. I'd spent the week leading up to the gala in a state of eerie calm. The kind of focused serenity that comes from knowing exactly what you're about to do and why it's necessary. My legal team had everything ready. The evidence was compiled, verified, and loaded into a presentation that would leave no room for doubt or denial. The evening began perfectly. Cocktails flowed, deals were discussed in hushed corners, and everyone kept asking me about the special announcement I'd promised. I gave them all the same mysterious smile and promised they wouldn't be disappointed. At exactly 9 p.m., I took the stage. The ballroom fell silent as 500 of the most powerful people in finance turned their attention to me. The woman they'd known for years as the brilliant but trusting CEO who'd built an empire through handshake deals and personal relationships. Thank you all for being here tonight. I began, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. As many of you know, Monrovia Capital has always been about more than just financial success. We've been about trust, family, and the belief that the people closest to us deserve our complete faith. I saw Kendall smile from her table near the front, raising her champagne glass slightly in acknowledgement. Damien nodded approvingly from beside her, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder in a gesture that suddenly made me wonder how long their betrayal had been more than just financial. Tonight, I want to talk about loyalty, I continued, letting my eyes sweep across the room. About what it means to trust someone completely and what happens when that trust is misplaced. The first sign that something was wrong came when the lights dimmed and the screens around the ballroom flickered to life. Instead of the usual Monrovia promotional video, they displayed a single email. Kendall's email from October 25th, blown up to massive proportions so everyone in the room could read every damning word. The reaction was immediate. Gasps echoed through the ballroom as people began reading the conspiracy laid out in black and white. I watched Kendall's face drain of color as she realized what was happening. Damien's champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor. This email, I said, my voice cutting through the growing murmur of shock, was sent by my chief financial officer and sister, Kendall Monroe, to my husband, Damien Carter, as part of their coordinated effort to steal $400 million from this company and destroy everything we've built together. The ballroom erupted. Reporters began frantically taking notes. Clients pulled out their phones to start recording. Board members looked between me and the screens in stunned disbelief. But I wasn't finished. For the past 4 months, I continued, advancing to the second part of my presentation. They have systematically attempted to hollow out Monrovia Capital's most valuable assets, using their positions of trust to create hidden accounts and unauthorized transfers. The screens now showed bank records, wire transfer confirmations, and the forged power of attorney documents I'd found in Damien's safe. Each piece of evidence was meticulously documented, time-stamped, and verified by forensic accountants whose credentials appeared at the bottom of each slide. Kendall tried to stand, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Please let me finish," I said with cold politeness. "I think our guests deserve to hear the complete story." The final piece of evidence was the recording from Damien's fake San Francisco meeting. His voice filled the ballroom as he enthusiastically described how he would restructure Monrovia's operations after my voluntary departure, complete with detailed plans for asset liquidation and staff reduction. The silence that followed was deafening. 500 people stared at the screens, then at me, then at Kendall and Damien, trying to process the magnitude of what they'd just witnessed. Then the questions started. Reporters shouting over each other, board members demanding explanations, clients asking whether their investments were secure. The carefully orchestrated elegance of the gala dissolved into chaos. Through it all, I stood calmly at the podium, watching my sister and husband realize that their carefully constructed plan had become their public confession. Security moved in as I'd instructed, not to arrest anyone. That wasn't my goal, but to escort Kendall and Damien from the premises before the situation could escalate further. As they were led toward the exit, Kendall broke free and turned back to face me, her composure finally cracking completely. "You don't understand," she screamed across the ballroom, her voice raw with desperation. "This isn't about money. This is about family. About what you've become. You chose this company over everything else, over everyone else." The pain in her voice was real, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of the old sympathy. But then I remembered the months of deception, the systematic betrayal, the cold calculation behind every smile she'd given me. Damien said nothing. He just stared at me from across the room, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with something that might have been respect, as if he finally understood who I really was and realized he'd never known me at all. The security team led them out through the service entrance, and I turned back to face my guests, my empire, my future. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice steady despite everything that had just happened, "I can assure you that every client asset remains secure and that Monrovia Capital will emerge from this stronger than ever. Now, shall we discuss the future?" They tried to steal my story, but I still hold the pen. The morning after the gala, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, everyone wanted the inside story of what they were already calling the Monroe betrayal. But I wasn't interested in giving interviews. I was too busy watching my enemies destroy themselves. Kendall's termination was swift and absolute. The board voted unanimously to remove her as CFO, citing breach of fiduciary duty and attempted corporate theft. Her access to all Monrovia systems was revoked before she'd even made it home from the plaza. The severance package she'd been counting on? Voided by the same corporate bylaws she'd helped me draft 3 years earlier. But the real satisfaction came from watching her try to salvage her reputation. She held a press conference 2 days later, standing outside a midtown law firm with tears streaming down her face, claiming she'd been manipulated by Damien and that her actions were motivated by concern for my mental health and erratic decision-making. The story fell apart within hours. The forensic accountants I'd hired released their preliminary findings, showing that the conspiracy dated back 7 months, long before any supposed concerns about my competence. The media had field day with the contradictions in her story, and by evening, she was trending on financial Twitter as a cautionary tale about family business gone wrong. Damien's lawyers folded even faster than I'd expected. Faced with criminal charges for attempted fraud and a civil suit that would have exposed every detail of their scheme, they negotiated a settlement that gave him exactly what he deserved: nothing. The prenup we'd signed before our marriage protected most of my personal assets, but I'd been prepared to be generous in a normal divorce. After what he'd tried to do, generosity was off the table. He left our marriage with his clothes, his car, and a non-disclosure agreement that would bankrupt him if he ever spoke publicly about our relationship or my business. The house, the art collection, the vacation properties, all mine. The joint accounts he'd been planning to drain, frozen and transferred to my sole control. Even his precious wine collection became part of my compensation for the emotional distress his betrayal had caused. But the most poetic justice came from the shell companies they'd created for their scheme. Since they'd all been established using Monrovia's existing corporate structure, they legally belonged to me. The very weapons they'd forged to destroy me became additional assets in my portfolio. The scandal, rather than damaging Monrovia Capital, actually strengthened it. Investors loved the story of a CEO who'd outsmarted her would-be betrayers. Our client base grew by 12% in the month following the gala, with new money pouring in from people who wanted to work with someone who could think 10 steps ahead of her enemies. The financial press painted me as a master strategist who'd turned personal betrayal into a business advantage. Forbes put me on their cover with a headline, "The CEO Who Played Chess While They Played Checkers." Harvard Business School called to ask if I'd consider teaching a seminar on crisis management. 3 months later, I stood in my corner office, looking out at the Manhattan skyline I'd conquered twice now, and allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The city sparkled below me like a constellation of possibilities, and for the first time in years, every single one of those possibilities belonged entirely to me. My assistant knocked and entered with the morning's financial reports. "The Hong Kong acquisition is moving forward ahead of schedule," she said, setting the papers on my desk. "And your 3 o'clock canceled. Something about family obligations." Family obligations. The phrase that used to mean something to me now felt like a relic from another life. I'd learned the hard way that the only family that mattered was the one you chose, not the one you were born into. Kendall tried calling once, about 6 weeks after the gala. I let it go to voicemail and deleted the message without listening. Whatever she had to say, apologies, explanations, desperate pleas for forgiveness, I wasn't interested. Some betrayals are too complete for redemption. Damien had moved to Los Angeles, according to the private investigator I'd hired to monitor his compliance with our settlement agreement. He was working for a small investment firm, making a fraction of what he'd earned at the peak of our marriage. Part of me wondered if he ever thought about what he'd given up, if he ever regretted choosing greed over genuine partnership. But only a small part. Most of me had moved on completely. The empire I'd built was stronger than ever, protected by new security measures and oversight systems that made another inside job impossible. I'd promoted 3 junior executives to senior positions, creating a leadership team chosen for competence and loyalty rather than blood relations or romantic connections. I'd also started dating again. Carefully, selectively, with prenups drawn up before the first dinner and background checks completed before the second. Trust but verify. The motto that should have guided my personal life all along. As I signed the final documents approving the Hong Kong expansion, I realized something had shifted in me permanently. The naive optimism that had made me vulnerable was gone, replaced by a crystalline clarity about human nature and the price of power. They tried to steal my story, to rewrite me as the villain in their narrative of justified revenge. Instead, they'd given me the greatest gift possible, the knowledge of who I really was when everything was on the line. I was Nyla Monroe. I'd built an empire twice, and I'd protect it from anyone who tried to take it from me, even the people I'd once loved most. Especially them.